tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, who you work with, and kind of where you're coming from before we kind of get started about what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, great to be with you, Erica. So my name is Peter, and I am a high school student who's very interested in paleoanthropology. And for several years now, I've been studying hominins, and I've been working with Dr. Todd Wood. I got interested after kind of his debut on the Is Genesis History movie, and I got in contact with him and eventually started working on some various hominin barminology projects, and that's kind of how I got involved in this area of research.
Yeah. Well, the folks who are on the channel, they know kind of where I'm coming from with this. So I'm kind of interested because, I'd seen one of your videos where you were effectively, you kind of like annihilated this take of, our knuckle walking Australopithecines. Which I was curious about because as you know, I'm working through Sanford and Roop's contested bones, and one of the very common talking points in that text is that we can't actually reconstruct the locomotion of these Australopithecines as being bipedal. And I was very tickled in a good way to see kind of that you were like, okay, no, we know they're bipedal, and while your stance is, different moving from that point onward, I was still very pleased to see that. So get into that a little. Where are you coming from with all that stuff?
Yeah, so first of all, I hadn't ever really seen your channel before. I think I may have seen one of your videos, but after you commented, I looked, and one of the first videos of yours that I really kind of stuck around and watched was, I realized you had reviewed the same video.
Oh, was it
Genesis Apologetics.
Yes.
And I had no idea. I'd never seen your review. And so watching your review, I was very interested in how similar our critiques of their material were.
Right. Yeah. And, one thing that really gets me with that is that I find this is rampant with, Genesis Apologetics in particular, but Answers in Genesis does this as well, is that it's the Australopithecines are characterized as if there's a single specimen, and that is Lucy, and that Lucy in particular, is this knuckle walking terrestrial, more or less, quadruped, and as both of us know, right, that's not going to fly with the anatomy that these members of this genus have. Similarly with paranthropines, they have all of the necessitations for a biped and none of the requirements for a quadruped. That nice bowl-shaped pelvis with the sagittally oriented iliac blades, the valgus knee, the ventral foramen magnum, anterior foramen magnum, and the foot morphology. So I was curious to see that. So I you sent me that paper, and I'll put that in the description, should we decide that we want to post this, so that others can kind of see where you're coming from as well. But so you're cool with Australopithecines being bipeds. So how does that fit in with the young Earth creationism?
Yeah, so I think in young Earth creationism, there's been a bit of kind of a false equivocation. People have thought that if we would find fossils of bipedal apes, that would, without a doubt, prove that evolution is true. That's the position of many young Earth creationists. I don't think that's the case, because I see all throughout the world, and in the fossil record, we see mosaic forms. I think that's something we can all agree on. Just morphologically, looking at them, we can see, this creature has the traits of this group and this group. And so in some sense then, it is a mosaic form, right?
Yes.
But the question there being, does mosaicism in terms of morphology also relate to ancestry, right? The question there, okay, so does how we classify things based on their morphology relate directly to common ancestry? So I think that's kind of one of the bigger things that we disagree about, right?
Yes.
The level to which common similarity equates to common ancestry.
Yeah, this to me, at least when I usually hear kind of framed similarly to that, is that this idea that it's common design, not common descent, right? It's forms that are kind of repurposed in multiple different taxa in order to achieve a common goal, right? So flight in various different types of birds, right? Or, the dorsal fin structures in various types of, cetaceans, something along those lines. For me, I find that to be tough to frame in a scientific sense, because I don't know how you're going to be able to differentiate between, what is evolution and what is, common design, right? Because I think we would both agree, at least if you kind of take Todd's stance, is that there is an element within animal groups of change over time, right? That is
Absolutely.
kind of honed by natural selection and these classic mechanisms. So with that in mind, how would you propose that we tell the difference?
So that is the issue. Okay, you're saying, how do we tell what is common design and common ancestry?
Right.
How do we distinguish between those? So to do that, I think, have to know what the original form was, right? So if we are going to propose, okay, so everything descended within this kind, we would need to know what the original form of that kind was to be able to tell, right, what has changed since then. So for a lot of things, I don't think we can necessarily know exactly what the original form necessarily was. So then that leads to the question, so how do we tell what is evolution and what is common design? And I think that we need to take somewhat of a holistic approach of looking at different characters of creatures, and we need to evaluate them, and we can recognize certain kind of threads of similarity within groups of creatures. So getting into my paper perhaps a little bit, my paper, it's co-authored with Dr. Todd Wood. It's called Revising Hominin Baraminology with Medoid Partitioning and Fuzzy Analysis. And so in that paper, what we do is we analyze these data sets of hominids by Berger and Dembo. And basically, what we show is that there are groupings within these hominids. So what I think then is, if everything within a certain group there shares a certain characteristic, or perhaps a certain combination of characters in common, we can probably assume that the common ancestor of them all had that trait as well, and thus kind of thinking back to that then probably being the original form. So something that is shared within a Brahmin probably being the trait that was held by the ancestor of the Brahmin.
Right, yeah, that's kind of what I gathered from what I was looking at. I found it to be an interesting paper because when I like I said, I looked into, I specifically went to Dembo's paper with these character suites, right, and identifying whether or not there is this clustering. And one thing that I noticed that Dembo 2016 did was kind of cross this molecular clock divergence with when we find these guys in the geologic column. Because I think that that's one of the that's a big sticking point for me, right? Because you mentioned earlier that, evolution, at least or we touched on this earlier rather, that evolution in the case of humans makes kind of a simple prediction, right? It's that, we should see morphologic change over geologic time, right? And we should see this occurring and spanning from, this more basal kind of Miocene ape all the way up to Homo sapiens and contemporaneous kin. So Homo neanderthalensis, Denisovans, things like that. And so I think that geologic column for me is big because that's showing that while, yes, we would expect from an evolutionary standpoint that there should be some degree of clustering as well. I think that the nature of classifying life tends to allow for clustering, especially along these vertical phylogenies, when we're looking back in time, because you're not getting a true sample, right? You're getting a kind of a scattershot sample of who's living when, so it's easier to create these groups. But that being said, I think that spanning of geologic time and those fuzzy edges that you were kind of talking about, where, you've almost got, while there are these kind of discrete categories that can unify certain groups, so maybe discrete characterizations that can unify Australopithecines and discrete characteristics that can unify Homo, the additional problem for me comes with the fact that there are members along these edges right, that almost seem to converge on one another, and that the differences are usually ones of degree, not of kind, for pardon my pun, not of category, I guess would be a better way of putting it. Well, not one of category. So, it's not, this organism has this given structure, or this organism has this given dental pattern, right? It's the size of the molar, or the cusping of the molar, or, the rounding of the cranial vault. You kind of get what I'm saying? What do you think about all that?
You're saying characters that aren't really so discrete that we can't really make into certain discrete character states. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that I think the differences are one of a gradient. So it's like
Sure.
So for instance, the size of something, right? It's not a 1 or a 0 kind of character trait. It's not you have it or you don't. It's
Okay.
Australopithecines and humans, members of Homo, let's just say, they share all of the same, bones, for instance. They have all of the same skeletal elements. It's mostly the sizes and shapes of them that tend to, tweak here and there. So, Australopithecines obviously are they have a different limb proportion than members of Homo, but not always, because Homo habilis is kind of an awkward-looking fellow, and so is Homo naledi. So I guess kind of what I'm asking is how do you and Todd propose we, from your perspective, deal with these kind of edge members?
So there's obviously two kind of ways that we can look at this, right? We can either evaluate things by individuals, or we can evaluate things by species, right? And I think what you're saying is perhaps it would make more sense to evaluate things based on the individual fossils themselves, because you're saying if we say that we're already putting all these individuals together as a species and then clustering that species is what you're saying, I think. And you were saying if we did that as individuals, we would see things as a little more fuzzy, a little less perhaps stuck into these groups. And
kind of that's kind of what I'm saying, but it's a little bit more along the lines, because I think we can't measure just on species, right? We have individuals that have to be accounted for, and some of them are aberrant. Obviously, there's intra species variation within Australopithecines, just like there is between any living animal.
I mean, Dr. Wood has published a study. It's called Baraminological Analysis Places Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Australopithecus sediba in the human holobrahmin.
Yeah.
And within that study, there is an interesting graph in there where he actually does take a number of different particular human fossils and some Australopithecine and other fossils, and does group them all. And you can see in that graph, it's figure 11 of that paper. Maybe I can put it on screen now. You'll see that all the humans do group to one side. Now, there is a bit of a lack of Australopithecine fossils in this particular thing, but I think when we look at these individuals, we do see that individuals do tend to actually group around a species. So, for example, in the work I've done, right, we have the Dmanisi hominins, right, which are kind of crazy and
they're wonky.
Yeah. Now, when we kind of look at things, though, we'll see how that kind of small population does often overlap almost directly with Homo erectus. And so that's an example of kind of using different individuals, and we can see that they actually do kind of group even with a whole broader kind of thing. So I think whether you do it on the species or on the individual, you are going to get similar results. I think that's obviously a place that we should definitely be doing more work, right, on looking at individual particular fossils.
Yeah, I think for me it's less of an issue with individuals versus species. I don't think that that's my issue here. I think it's more that looking at the differences between Australopithecines and members of genus Homo, which there clearly are differences, otherwise we wouldn't have them within two genera, right? We would have them within the same genus. And some anthropologists through history have argued that that should be the case. I myself think that it complicates things unnecessarily. I think they're fine the way that they are. But I think that we can discretely lump species, for instance, horizontally. So today, lions and tigers, we can list things that all tigers have that no lions have, and all things that, things that all lions have and no tigers have. And some of the things with lions and tigers are matters of like anatomical ones and zeros, right? The mane in the male lions, right? This type of sexual dimorphism, right, is absent in tigers. But I don't think that being able to lump them discretely into these two groups, because very clearly if we were to take their character suites and plot them along a graph, we would get two distinct clusters between lions and tigers, with maybe a bit of branching, but a bit of kind of reaching for one another, but there shouldn't be any overlap, right? But they're all still felids, right? We would consider them all felids, and I think both would say it's probably quite likely that lions and tigers share a common ancestor. So I think my issue from where I'm coming from, my issue with baraminology is that I feel like, yes, Australopiths and members of Homo should cluster. They're different genera. What we shouldn't see is what the figure that showed up in Dembo's paper. I think I'll have to put it up and send it to you later, but it's got this nice continuum of organisms. It's got morphologic suites on one axis and geologic time on the other. And at least I think this is Dembo. I hope this is Dembo. It might be something else I was looking at. I'll find it and make sure I get you the right.
I'm pretty sure Dembo did do it with the radiometric dates. Yeah.
I know the figure I'm thinking of has geologic time. I'm just trying to remember if Dembo was the one with the morphologic suite or if it was molecular clock on the X. Regardless, I certainly know that both of those figures exist. So I'll find the right one that I'm looking for and put it up here and also send it to you as well. But you don't have this clear cutoff point. Now, if you take the full suites, you can show these clusters. You can do that with sexes in any dimorphic primate as well. That doesn't mean that they're not members of the same species, because taking a step back, they share more than they are dissimilar ultimately.
Right. So you're talking about the very level at which we look at things, right? What struck me in this particular analysis is how, right, we can see this is in some sense, we can see how this matches almost perfectly with what we call genera, right? We have, in my analysis, the Paranthropus genus clusters way off in the distance, right? The Australopithecines cluster somewhat closer to humans, but also somewhat away, and then the humans cluster by themselves, right? So I think, in some sense, that is important, right, to realize that using these methods, we can actually draw these distinctions. You've said various things in your videos like, we can't really tell what is human and what is not. And I really just don't see that, because in my experience, I can tell what is a human and what is not. And so evolutionary theory would obviously suggest that you're going to have this gradient, right, that goes all the way from these Miocene apes, and it's going to be basically a seamless transition all the way from these apes all the way to humans, right? And you are going to have all these transitional things, but in my experience, we can often assign something to a particular species, right? We can tell, yeah, this is a species. There's variation within a species, but I just don't see this perfect transition, because things do cluster like this. And obviously we could say, well, we haven't found the fossils of these things that are, perfectly, going to have the Australopithecine Homo intermediate fossils or something like that. But I see this as more being just this gradient. Not being a gradient, sorry.
I think we don't need, honestly, I would kind of disagree with you there. I think appealing to, we just need more fossils, I would propose that we have enough already to show this gradient. I was looking, I clicked over, and unfortunately I'm using, OBS, so it's going to show that I flopped. I was looking for one of your specific figures on the Revising Hominin Baraminology. So for a minute, it's going to be like me because I was trying to tell you which figure specifically I was talking about. But there are points on this line that reach far up linearly on the Australopithecine cluster, and Homo points that reach down farther too. And that's, to me, that's that transition that you're kind of talking about here. It's late Australopithecus, right, which would be Australopithecus sediba and would be Homo habilis on the early Homo side, that converge onto this this kind of transitional line.
So that's where I would disagree with you, right? So obviously in our paper, we kind of did something that was interesting, right? We placed, I mean, not us, but the statistical analyses placed Australopithecus sediba like very firmly within the human group, as I'm sure you saw. So that's obviously a very controversial result of our work, right? That Australopithecus sediba is far within the humans. So you brought up that Australopithecus sediba kind of seems to be this end merging population of the Australopithecines into the humans. But our work seems to show that rather than that, Australopithecus sediba quite firmly does seem to be an actual human.
Yeah, but I looked at the way that you guys kind of did this analysis, and it's more along the lines of, at least from what I understood, right, the kind of dumbed down version as far as I was trying to understand it. Like I said, it's been a hot minute since I've looked at the statistics. It's sort of like, okay, we've kind of got this idealized what is a human, this suite of characteristics that are on a gradation, right? Because it's not a 1 or a 0, because we share all of the same morphologic skeletal elements as the Australopithecines. And then you've got the elements that are kind of diagnostic of an Australopithecine, right? But these diagnoses are themselves on a gradient, right? At least conventionally within paleoanthropology, I keep wanting to say it's Bernard Wood. It's Lee Berger. What Lee Berger wanted to do with Australopithecus sediba was assign it to Homo when he first discovered it. Now, there's an issue with this that's kind of twofold. One, he had the skull of a juvenile, which is a bit can be problematic because most apes, including humans, they tend to become more. They tend to get less neonatic as they grow older. Hence, neonatic being baby faced. Some of us more than others. But typically, right, along the differences between this basal Miocene ape and this anatomically modern Homo sapiens, the two primary differences writ large, other than the aspects of facial morphology and kind of the minutiae of that, is cranial capacity and bipedal efficiency, right? Bipedalism emerges quite early. We see, the Australopithecines are bipeds. Ardipithecus is probably at least, facultative biped. This bipedalism at least sometimes. But the cranial capacity can be plotted directly linearly, as can the aspects of this emerging bipedality. So I think that this clustering that you're talking about, that to me, all that is a remnant of being able to say this is a member of this genus and this is a member of this genus. No different than saying chimpanzees have certain traits that classify them in the genus Pan, and gorillas have certain traits that put them into the genus Gorilla. But they're both still hominids, and they likely share a common ancestor. So I don't think that this ability to say, very neatly, this is in fact the human and this is in fact not, works with the likes of Australopithecus sediba, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and if you accept it, Australopithecus gari, because they have brain case sizes whose lower end overlaps with Australopithecus africanus. And in some cases, they're less efficient in their locomotor pattern than earlier.
I would take a bit of a different view of cranial capacity. I mean, we have things like Homo floresiensis, right? Modern pygmies that overlap in brain size with gorillas.
Sure, but it's based off of brain to body size ratio. So their brains are quite small, but they're not really all that small when you're scaling it for their size. So it's one of those issues where it's like, Homo floresiensis is certainly an interesting case, and what I've seen, I'd love to get some DNA off of the thing, but even let's take Homo floresiensis and put it, in the group with everybody else. There have been, a metric, glut. There's been a glut of studies that do cranial capacity with regard to body size. And floresiensis is, while it is on the lower end, it still does fall within the range of other, members of Homo, of that large brain for its body size. So I do think cranial capacity is, within hominins, necessarily important when it comes to defining what it is that makes a human a human.
I think it's important for defining hominins, but I'm not so certain that it is important for defining humans. Because hominins, that's one of the trademarks of hominins, right?
Yeah, but not early ones.
Well,
like Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus, these guys are pinheads. And what defines Ardipithecus as a hominin is those reduced canines and that anterior foramen magnum. Otherwise, this thing is indistinguishable from the other apes that are living at the Dryopithecines that are living at the same time as it. So it's kind of like, okay, what at least what I've been told is, how do you get into the hominin club? Getting into the hominin club is having facultative to obligate bipedalism and the morphology that goes along with it, and a reduction in canine size, because both of those things all hominins have. Do all hominins have large brain case sizes? No. In fact, most of them don't have large brain case sizes when compared to the later, more derived hominins at all. And so I think that's partially why it makes a good metric. I don't think if these things cluster discretely because they are...
I think it's rather simplistic to only look at things based on, brain to body size ratio, though. I mean, for example, these particular analyses, they're done off of 300 or more, traits, depending on which character matrix I'm thinking of there. But the point being, I think holistic view of things is important. And right, if you do place the fossils in terms of the radiometric age and look at the brain to body size ratio, you can see how, if those are all related, possibly, those could be a transition from, small brains to large brains. But for me, that simply just does not prove they are related. You know what I mean? Yes, we can place them in this kind of transitional looking area, but I think that it is important to look at this holistically. And when we do look at things based on a whole ton of different traits, I think it does become more apparent that it's not quite so simple as just this increase from small brains to large brains.
I agree wholeheartedly. I'm listening. Continue talking. I'm hoping to illustrate my point with a small whiteboard, but please continue.
Okay. So basically, your argument concerning baraminological results is simply that that we can point out things in clusters, and evolution can explain that, because evolutionary ideas would say that things can be that even though life is this kind of basically perfect gradient, we still can kind of decide which things belong in which genus, is basically what you're saying.
No, I actually think that species are entirely arbitrary. I think that there is no species concept that one can use to accurately place organisms that is consistent across all types of life. So, for instance, biological species concept, grizzly bears and polar bears, these are to an intuitive point. You look at these two, you say these are different species. They live in completely different areas of the world. They have adaptations to completely different climates, and yet they can breed and produce viable offspring. So I think the biological species concept doesn't work for extants. So it's and you could look at other aspects, other species concepts, but none of them work back in time, and so back in time vertically and, with extants horizontally. So what I would say is that any attempt to group life into discrete categories it's kind of a fool's errand. I think it's very helpful, and I think it's necessary to try, but I think that genera are ultimately, if we had, from an evolutionary standpoint, if we had a perfect tree of life, we had access to the genomes and the fossil specimens in pristine condition of all life back to a common ancestor of everything, it would be impossible to denote species. But what I was going to say, and so,
personally, I would be more in favor of a morphological species concept.
So you're Linnaean?
To a certain extent. I do see your point that there is obviously gradients between species, and when there's hybridization and all that, right, that obviously comes up with issues. But I think generally we can recognize species, right? We can recognize that there is some type of form there, right? Like a tiger, yeah, it might be able to mate with a lion and produce fertile offspring, but we can recognize that there is something about a tiger that does make it unique from a lion.
Yeah,
right?
But that's because we're looking horizontally.
And when we're talking about species in the hominins, for example, Homo sapiens, I mean, we could say, what's a defining feature of that? Something like the chin, for example.
Sure.
I mean, yes, that's kind of arbitrary, right? But my point is, I think there is, to some extent, features that we can use to denote species.
I'm not on board with that, though, because we see examples today of, like, ring species emerging, right? What's the defining characteristic of, oh gosh, I forget the genus name. It's a California salamander. It's like, what are the defining characteristics? Well, it has this kind of spot pattern, and it will only mate with members of its own species, and, it has this kind of webbing behind its fingers, etc., etc. Populations spread out, they adapt to their new environments, right, and they become slightly different, and you end up with this nice ring of organisms, each occupying their own territory. And directly adjacent organisms will mate, but ones that are more than one adjacent area away from each other will not. So species recognition concept doesn't work. Biological species concept doesn't work. You can't find which kind of which kind of genomic demarcators you could utilize to say this is definitively where one genome becomes a distinct genome from the one that it kind of descended from. You can't do any of those things with it, and yet morphologically they are at least wholly within our standard of zoology across the world, still morphologically the same as one another, except for maybe differences in coat patterns. This is something that guinea will have, and they'll still cross-mate. So I think that nature is very messy, and it becomes, I don't think that it's easier with extants.
Well,
but
I agree to a certain point, right? Because obviously I believe that, okay, so maybe we should start a little bit more back at the beginning, because we've kind of gotten very far into things very fast here.
You're right, yeah, you're right.
But, okay, so obviously I believe that about 6,000 years ago, God created the earth, the universe, everything, and he created these distinct kinds of animals and other things, like he created distinct kinds of plants, and he created humans separately as well. And I think that since that time, we've had diversification within these kinds. So to that extent, then, I somewhat agree with you, right, that there is a gradient within a kind. So what I see when I look at these clusterings is I see diversification within a kind, and I see that creatures have diversified out here from this original ancestor of the kind, and yet they don't overlap, right, with other kinds. And I think that your particular idea, that we could look at these traits and just put these in a perfect kind of line, isn't very realistic, considering that we can see these differences between these things. I brought up that paper in which Dr. Wood, did those individual things of those humans and some of the Australopithecines and some other things, and you could see that all these humans cluster together in this one area of the graph. And it's fuzzy, right? Because we're looking at all these individual specimens. But when we do that, it still is distinct from the Australopithecines. And you could say, well, that's based on the characters, right? And, maybe we're looking at characters that are just diagnostic of these. But I just don't really see a better way of approaching it, really, then. Like,
no, I think that's totally fair. But that being said, what I see when I look at the graph that you guys have is something akin to this. You've got several organisms that you've kind of circled and said, this is Homo, and you've got others that you look at and you say, okay, these are Australopithecines, and then you've got some that push it at the borders. And you guys have kind of chosen to draw this line in between the two and say, which is curious because it's right at the level of the genus. I agree with you, but conventional science doesn't disagree with that. That doesn't differentiate it from evolutionary theory. What that says to folks who are within the evolutionary sciences, like for instance myself with anthropology, what I do at that point is I say, what does this thing look like? what does the most derived, quote unquote, or most homo-looking of the Australopithecines look like, and what does the most basal or most australopithecine
See, but that's not what we see, because Australopithecus sediba, for example, right? We have a single cranium, so essentially what we're looking at there is one single specimen, right? According to your theory, Australopithecus sediba should show up somewhere on this kind of line merging into the human genus, right?
Kind of.
But we see Australopithecus sediba, this thing which you claim is somehow transitional, in fact falling far within the human cluster there. And so when I look at that, I'm saying, yeah, okay, well, actually, what you claim to be this transitional thing is not showing up in a location that would in any way suggest that it's transitional. In fact, it's falling far within humans. And so in that sense, I think it would disagree with you.
Kind of, but it doesn't really fall that far in humans. It falls in your human cluster, but I mean, I would agree with that because I think that Australopithecus sediba is, in my opinion, the most derived of the Australopithecines. Even though it's just a kid, even though MH1 is just a child, it still has a lot of the diagnostic characteristics that if you were to age them up using the morphologies of other known australopiths, it's going to be, having more gracile face, it's going to have that kind of reduced post-anterior or post-canine dentition, things along those lines. So I would agree with that. But again,
my point is we don't see it falling in a transitional area.
I don't know.
You see it falling within the humans. Well,
yeah, you see it falling in the human cluster, but you see it falling on that basal end of the human cluster. So at that point, too, I have to wonder, Peter, are we weighting these characteristics all equally? Because if that's the case, then you're weighting post-anterior dentition being more homo, the same as a cranial capacity or a more
well,
less
that comes
mobile
to this whole
shoulder
discussion
blade.
about whether or not we should be weighting characters at all, right? And
Are they weighted? Do you know?
They are not.
Okay.
I think that character weighting, in some sense, is always going to be almost as arbitrary as any other way of doing it. In some sense, selecting characters for your matrix is a way of character weighting, right? Because you are choosing, when you select characters for a matrix, as Berger and Dembo did, they're basically choosing those characters and saying these characters have more weight than other characters, right? So in essence, choosing characters is a way of character weighting.
I gotta say though, Peter, that I was unsure. I was planning on asking you, but I'd had it listed on my questions on whether or not these characters were weighted, primarily because when I looked at Dembo, as I mentioned earlier, at least I'm pretty sure it could have been the Berger paper. But looking at these other analyses, they do fall on the gradient, and I noticed that on that and in all of these transitional spaces as well. So when I read the paper that you sent me, I noticed that it said that Dr. Wood had revised some of these characters, and I was going to ask you what that meant, and if that means de-weighting them.
That's okay. So what happened is we in this particular paper, we picked up some more different methods of analyzing them, right? So one of the ways that we analyzed them was using, I believe it's the Jacquard's distance. And the benefit of that is what we can do is we can, it somehow adjusts for whether we're talking about an absent present character state. And so, so in that sense, it is kind of like giving a little more weight to like absent present character states, if only in the Jacquard distance.
I got
so that is that. So that is what that particular phrase meant in terms of that. The character matrix was recoded so that absent present character states would be represented by zeros and ones, so that when we use the Jacquard's distance, we could account for that.
Okay, but overall, I don't know about that, Peter, because not weighting characters means that you're effectively saying that perhaps a distal condyle of the femur is, if it looks more homo, and the cranial capacity, which would look more Australopithecine like an Australopithecus sediba, that these two things are equivalent, and they are not. Behaviorally, they're not. They're not equivalent morphologically. One, obviously, in sheer size, they're different. They're controlled by, at least we know this from today with extants, developmentally they're completely controlled by different regions. I don't think you can do that. And that explains why these clusters do appear distinct, though. But I don't think that methodologically speaking is sound.
Well, I don't think it's very methodologically sound to kind of place arbitrary weights upon certain characters, right? Because that's always kind of just based on the bias of whoever's doing the study, right?
I think potentially that can be the case, but I think that gets down into the weeds, right? I think that no one in paleontology as a whole with any kind of organism would think that a distal condyle is equivalent to a cranial capacity. I mean, that would be like saying attendance for one day in lecture is equivalent in your final grade as your final exam. These two things they impact the way the organism lives drastically, in the same way that anything having to do with locomotion is going to impact it drastically, right? I don't know that you can, and I'm a student in this. I'm by no means a PhD, and I know Dr. Wood, is a great scientist, but I don't know anthropologically speaking if that works.
Things, barmenological evaluations have been done with weighted characters.
And how did that work for hominins?
I believe that would be like genomics papers.
Okay.
They disagree with us, or he would disagree with us on the conclusion of Australopithecus sediba being human.
Okay. And I would imagine Naledi too. I would imagine they would disagree with Homo naledi as well.
Yes, I think there was Homo naledi was disagreed
because I know Dr. Wood. I know Dr. Wood's very
there's a series of papers back and forth about that.
Right, yeah, right. And I'm not I hope it's clear, I'm obviously have not, I don't know the entire history of kind of how you and Dr. Wood have kind of handled this, but I'm only speaking from, what I understand about reconstructions and with the morphologies of these organisms, as well as how they impact behavior. Because my specialization is extant primates, and there's aspects obviously that you can't take from extant primatology and apply to the fossil record. I wholeheartedly will admit this, but I do think that while you're 100% correct, there can be a bias to weighting certain characters. I think that kind of like how you say, you know a species when you see it. I think you can certainly say, when one character should be weighted greater than another. Not that all of them should be equal or that you should give these arbitrary distinctions. But there's gotta be, I just don't think that you can assess them as single uniform suites, because that's just not how evolution is proposed to work.
Well, I think that's why it's important to use so many characters, because often a lot of characters are linked together, right?
This is true.
So when we have something with the brain case, that has a lot of different effects upon the shape of the skull, the brain, and that can reflect itself in other characters. So in some sense, then, when a character is changing enough to an organism and changes how an organism behaves that much, you're going to see that effect in other characters.
Yeah, I would agree, but there's also, to the contrary, a problem where the more characters you add, the less weight each individual character possesses in and of itself. So if you have 10 facial and, let's say 10 craniodental traits and 90 postcranial traits, right? You're going to end up with everybody clumping within Homo, because things like the facial prognathism or anterior dentition size or brain case size, these things are just being outweighed by the sheer number of postcrania. And if all these guys are bipedal, they're going to possess a lot of the same postcranial traits, which is why weighting, in my opinion, is important. You know what I mean?
I see your point there.
Let me ask you a question, because I'm curious about this.
Okay.
How do you suppose, so within the paper, because I know we've been harping on the paper for a hot minute, and I really kind of want to pick your brain just on like where you're coming from some of this stuff. How do you suppose within the kind of, let's take the paper and say we'll have the human holobarum and include the results that you and Dr. Wood achieved. So how is it that you get from a created pair, right? Are Adam and Eve Homo sapiens, or is it like genetic entropy that gets you to Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi? How do you get from humans to the other members of the holobarum from your perspective?
So first of all, addressing the question of what was the original human form from a creationist perspective. That's obviously a topic of a lot of debate and gets very heated very quickly. I don't think Homo sapiens was the original human form.
Okay, that's interesting.
For me, the fossil record, first of all, simply doesn't align with that at all. And I have problems with radiometric dating. I think that's fairly obvious. But when I look at things, I think I'm more comfortable with looking at things stratigraphically speaking, using more of index fossils, types of that to kind of...
So like relative age relative.
Precisely, okay. Relative age. I'm more comfortable with that. What we see, in particular in Homo sapiens, is that the further back we go, Homo sapiens begins looking more like Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Heidelbergensis. It starts getting some more pronounced, brow ridges and other features which are somewhat diagnostic of other species. And so I think it's fairly obvious that Homo sapiens is not the original human form.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that before. That I can see where you're coming from. I think from the perspective that you're taking, I think that's more solid, honestly.
Now, that obviously gets a lot of creationists very upset. But I think that is kind of a view thinking, okay, we are humans, and thus humans must look exactly like us. But I don't think that's really correct. So who do I think is the original human form? Ultimately, I can't really say.
I was mostly just curious.
My personal idea at the moment is possibly Homo erectus or something along that line, very similar to that. Ultimately, I don't think we have enough information to know exactly yet, and I think we need some analyses to kind of work at that. So that's one interesting idea, I think, of research within creationism, so that we can kind of develop our model a little more. Because personally, I think attacking evolution isn't the most helpful thing to do. I think working on our own model and building our own model up so that it can challenge yours is more beneficial. And I think from our view, using phylogenies to kind of try to trace common ancestry is doable, but only within a created kind. So I think that's an area where it could be interesting for creationists to kind of look at this and do human phylogenies within a created kind to kind of parse out a little bit exactly who the original human was from our point of view.
So allow me to, I want to challenge you a little bit on the created kind thing with regard to kind of other species, because one of my issues with created kinds with extants, so horizontally speaking, is I have a problem with standardization along those lines. So I think that, looking at the work of Steve Schaffner, and then of course we recently had the sequencing of the full bonobo genome, so their DNA. And humans are, give or take, approximately 98.8% similar to Pannins with regard to coding base pairs along alignable regions, and about 96 when we're looking at indels included. This is much closer than what we see with the genetic or comparative genomic work done with like rats and mice, which are around 95% similar, or lions and tigers, which are about 95, or African and Asian elephants, or Loxodonta and elephas, which are around 95. So Neanderthals seat around 99.7, and the average human is about 98.9 to another human. So Neanderthals, I think we would both agree, are, in my opinion, related to humans, and I would imagine in your opinion are members of the human holobaramon. And that's less than a percentage difference, and that's using those alignable regions. So how do you propose baraminology could or should be standardized, or should it even be standardized from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I've seen you kind of challenge this in a number of your videos. You say, things like, as you said, rats and mice are this % similar, humans and chimpanzees are this % similar, thus humans and chimpanzees must be related. Well, from a baraminological point of view, genetics has never really been the basis for determining a kind. You could argue that perhaps it ought to be, but we've never used genetics really very widely for like defining kinds. We've really used morphological features, right? And I think that this ties into kind of a broader kind of point about how much creatures can diversify, I think, right within their kind. So if rats and mice are the same kind, I think there have been some studies on that from entomologists, right? We obviously then, from our point of view, have seen a lot of diversification within that created kind, right? Whereas in the humankind, then, perhaps we haven't really seen so much diversification. So then the question then becomes, from our point of view, how much diversification happens within a kind, right? Because you would say, okay, well, diversification is basically limitless, right? Given enough time, enough mutations will happen, and things can basically just transform as mutations allow. Well, there's two possibilities, right? We could either say there is a limit to diversification, or we could say that things simply didn't start in the same place. So what I'm saying here is, okay, so within the humankind, maybe there are limits to diversification. For example, mules, right? It's a cross between a horse and a donkey, and they're sterile because of genetics having a hard time aligning together in the embryonic stage, right? Because they have such big differences because of the different chromosomes and the number of chromosomes that they have, and it's just hard for them to match up. And so I can see that as being, for example, a place where diversification stops at a certain point. Horses and donkeys have become different from each other, and thus, diversification in that regard can't keep them interbreeding, right?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I do. I think my issue was kind of more kind of front loaded on your kind of last statement, because I think that while I get why you would want to use morphology, genetics with regard to, Mendel's laws of inheritance, right, states that organisms do, especially sexual organisms, pass down their genetics to their offspring, right? Mm-hmm. And it's through this way that we can establish, things like family trees within humans, or within dogs, we can establish breeding history all the way back to, when a breed was first kind of recognized. But I think
right, I see your point. It's almost the same as your point about homology, right? All these features share these kind of common things, and
kind of, except homology, though, like morphology gets dicier because phylogeny doesn't necessarily directly, one-to-one have a recapitulation in the genotype, right? So phenotype, of course, reflects genotype, but not in a one-to-one fashion. But the beauty of genetics is, and we know of no violation of this outside of horizontal gene transfer in bacteria, is that organisms do pass down their genes to their offspring. And by looking at highly variable regions, you can trace this back within a species, and then you can do it between species in many groups of organisms.
So from the creationist point of view, then, that becomes the question, right? So
yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Our point of view, right, then is, okay, so God in the beginning created humans, and he created some type of kind that included chimpanzees and gorillas, probably. And why did he create us so similar? Morphologically, but also when we look at the genes, right? So we would propose that the similarities that are found in the genes are more a result of common design, right, as the morphology is. But then the question becomes, okay, so we have these mutations, right? That what we think are mutations in the same place on humans and in chimpanzees, right?
Sure, and or ERVs, what have you.
Right. And I think there's several ways that we can explain that. One is that perhaps they're not mutations at all. perhaps they were simply created like that way. And because we see it different in what we call more basal animals, we think they're mutations, but in fact they're not actually mutations. And another view would be that mutations aren't completely random, right? They happen. There was a paper published recently that talked about how mutations are more bound to happen in certain places.
Sure.
And I think that could possibly explain the mutations that show up in humans and chimpanzees being very similar.
I think that becomes tough with stuff like gulo breakages that go back all the way through the through the haplorine clade. Just because it would have to happen, depending on how many primate haplorine kinds you have, baramin that you have, it's going to have to happen at the exact same spot and only appear through kind of molecular clockwork that it happened in once at the exact same time in all of these organisms. But I think more importantly than that to me is the fact that it's like you and I would both accept that a paternity test works, right? It's not common design that a dad and his kid share, these variable sections of DNA. And we would accept that a dog and a wolf are related and we wouldn't say that it's common design that dogs just share these highly variable segments of DNA with wolves. Comparative genomics is done the exact same way with humans and pannins, and we don't find a demarcation there. I find it, and I used to be a theistic evolutionist, and this was one of my big problems, is that I found it, or when I was at YEC, actually take it way back in time, I find it inherently deceptive to not have a demarcation there if we're expected to consider these things as different kinds. How can we investigate it if it doesn't show up in the one thing biologically that is an infallible means, as far as we know, to present, of determining general relationships within organisms, within the tree of life?
Right. So to young Earth creationists, that poses the question once again: why did God create humans so similar to chimpanzees?
Or why didn't He create a line
or
amongst the kinds?
Australopithecines? I think there's several reasons why. One is that I think that God created us to be in dominion over creation, but also to care for it. And He created us, I believe, as animals so that we realize the biological processes of other creatures, right? So that we, as stewards of creation, recognize the similarities that we have to other creatures, and thus we have an idea of how we can better care for creation because we are so similar to other parts of it. And another thing is that we are suited to fill very similar kind of environments, right? We as humans were created to live in a garden, and we were created to eat fruit, right? So in many ways, right, that's similar to other creatures, right? That we live in this certain environment, we have a similar diet in some respects. So I think there are reasons to why it would make sense from our point of view that God would create humans similar to other creatures.
I can sympathize with that, but that's tough for me because that gets into the realm of not being empirically testable. If a reason that God has that isn't reflected in any kind of tangible way, that's tough for me, and I can speak for many other folks who are interested in science to get on board with. With regard to things like we're created to live and well suited to live in a garden, I would propose that humans are morphologic omnivores to the core. Our canines are reduced, certainly, but within primates, and I know this from my primatology background, but large canines within primates are not for the purpose of stripping meat or killing, members not of their group. They're typically for territory defense if they occur in males and females, and if it's in a dimorphic species, it's male-male competition. So, it's like antlers on a deer. Cervids don't use their antlers to hunt. And more importantly, it's our simple stomachs. I mean, we're monogastrics. We have the stomachs of omnivores, not the complex fermentation-style guts that we see even in certain derivations of within gorillas, which are significantly more folivorous than their chimp cousins or their orangutan cousins, right?
Right, and so that is a break that we see, I would think, at the fall, right? We have these creatures before the fall, which have this perfect diet, and after the fall, things are skewed up and messed up, right? And perhaps that in some ways explains how humans got other features, right? A lot of creationists would believe that God kind of programmed into creatures the ability to adapt after the fall to changing conditions.
Yeah, and I've heard that before, this idea of like how the fall, changes the diets and things like that. And when I was a theistic evolutionist, I wasn't down with that theologically speaking, but that's for another time, certainly, and I am no theologian.
So I'd like to bring up here a minute some things which I think are predictions of young Earth creationism in this field that have been validified.
Okay.
So one of those was the groups of taxa and not the continuous morphology. And we've obviously talked about that quite a bit, right? And whether or not we agree about creatures being in these groups or not. But I think that is actually one direct prediction of young Earth creationism, that creatures, when we look at them, should fall into groups and not this continuous gradient going all the way back. And the very fact, I think, that we can recognize these groups when looking at them does imply that there is discontinuity even among things that you think are related.
Yeah, but I gotta push back on that, because for me, it's like evolution has been recognizing genera since the dawn of it, since its inception. I mean, being able to categorize organisms is a part of evolution. It's a part of being able to say, okay, this large scale group is here, and it transitions into this large scale group, or you see, cladogenesis, and it separates off, and then there's this large scale group, et cetera, et cetera. The difference between our two hypotheses boils down to, do the groups have fuzzy edges or do they not? Because if they blend...
No, it doesn't. Because obviously I accept that things have fuzzy edges. The human holobrahmin, as I see it, is not perfectly just this perfect little thing, right? There's obviously variation within a group. The question is whether these groups overlap.
Yes, and I would contend that that's what I'm saying with these fuzzy. Maybe I'm using your term fuzzy edges, and we're meaning different things here. I'm meaning that organisms that are from a geologic sense, that are going to be at the more derived end of Australopithecines, should share more in common with early Homo, or at least equivalent amount in common with early Homo, than they do with prior or more distant Australopithecines, so the base of Australopithecus. Same with Ardipithecus, same going back into the Miocene apes. And I would propose that we do see that. I would propose that if you guys did your study and weighted the characteristics in any way, I think you would see that as well, because we've seen that in other studies.
Well, once again, that has been done, as I mentioned, by genomics, and they did not come to that conclusion. Well, I don't necessarily agree with their conclusion either, for various reasons.
So you're telling me they weighted characteristics and they also got two distinct clusters. Would you be willing to pull that up and show me?
Yeah.
If you can't, it's cool, because obviously I've not read it, so I can take your word for it. You can send it to me later if you'd rather. But I'm pressing X to doubt on that. I don't think that they would find that you get two distinct clusters if you weight characteristics, because no other paleoanthropologist ever has.
So let's see here. Let's see if it's in this paper. You know what? I probably don't have time to look through this whole paper to figure out exactly at the moment, but it is called, here's the name, Homo naledi, probably not part of the human holobrahmin, based on Brahminic reanalysis, including postcranial evidence by Genomics.
Hopefully we can have another chat at some point too, and get into some of this a little bit more, because I get a little passionate, but I'm just enjoying myself. I mean, I hope you don't interpret any of my bouts of passion as aggression. I just like talking about this stuff. I'm not. No, I
understand that.
I'm sure you feel the same way.
I have another thing which I think is a prediction of creationism.
Okay.
Or creationists, and that would be humans having human-like behavior every human having very human-like behavior. And I think that was, in some part, vindicated in the Neanderthals, right? We obviously, creationists and evolutionists started having very different views of the Neanderthals, and you eventually came around to our view that the Neanderthals were in fact very, very human and buried their dead and things like that. And I think that's a similar thing with Homo naledi, right? Homo naledi was very different from many other different types of humans, right? But we thought it was human, and it appears to have been burying its dead, right? And so we, from our point of view, would expect that we would see essentially modern human behavior, like in regards to exactly how these other species were acting, and that is what we see. I mean, obviously, the fossil record gets more and more fragmentary the further back we go, but I think that is a prediction of creationism that humans, like Homo naledi, would be practicing very human-like behavior.
I know I'm doing this every time, but I got to push back on that because I'm taking a hominin evolution class. It's a seminar with one of my professors who actually worked on the Homo naledi paper with Lee Berger, as well as on the Australopithecus sediba paper. His name is Lucas Delazine. So the issue with the Neanderthal thing, he structured this class in hominin evolution like so. The first half of the class, we go through every hominin, basically up to 2000, and the early opinions. And then the second half of the class is filled with, okay, what do we think of them now? So it's a historical perspective. So and we're starting with, moving backwards in time. So Neanderthals were first on the list. That's what we had to read this past week. And I read Sir Arthur Keith's first work on Neanderthals. And as early as Arthur Keith in 1915, and I'll hopefully be able to put a graphic up here because I got to edit in intros and outros to this video, so I'll put a graphic up. And any graphics that you want me to put up, please just say, and I'll put them up wherever you'd like me to. But Arthur Keith noted in 1915 that Neanderthals, while they are distinct as a species, in fact, he argued that they should be a distinct genus, distinct from humans generically. But he called them artisanal, right? He said they're artisans. They bury their dead. They do things like create these Mousterian tool items, right? As early as 1915, Arthur Keith recognized that these guys, at least the paleoanthropological community, largely recognized that these guys were doing things that were distinctly human. Now, at the same time, he does this full-on analysis, and this should tell you how old, this text is that, they're talking about Homo erectus as Pithecanthropus, right? So it's like, this is an old text. And he's talking about how the strange thing about Neanderthals is that they've got some traits that are indeed very derived and unique to Neanderthals. So be pterodont molars, right? Retromolar gaps, stuff like that. But then they also have traits that are seemingly simian. That's the word that they used at the time. And so he came to the conclusion that this thing was doing a lot of the same stuff that humans are doing, but was distinctly different from us. So, Yul Rock, I think it was Yul Rock in 1986, comes along after that, and he's like, here's another thing that's very strange, is their facial morphology. They seem to be having this weird issue with their mouths and with their zygomatics, where they've got this heavy occlusal load. Why do they have beveled wear on their incisors? Come all the way up to the most recent paper through Green et al. In 2010, when the Neanderthal genome was sequenced, and you see the work of, I think it was a 2016 paper, maybe out of Israel, I can't remember, where they look at where this divergence happened, and they came to the conclusion, this totally meshes with your thoughts, right? That Neanderthals and humans didn't descend from them, they're distinct sister species. But to your point, if creationists did predict that, that Neanderthal behavior was going to get increasingly more human, then it wasn't the majority of the paleoanthropological community that they were griping with, but the media.
Well, it depends how far back you go.
Well, that's true too. Yeah, but I would argue.
My point is, creationists have historically held that humans were always going to be fully human, right?
Yes.
So whatever we were looking at that was a human, it was going to act like a human, right? It was going to be behaviorally almost identical to us, and I think that that's something that we did predict, and once again, obviously there's some different views about that on Neanderthals, but I don't think that was something you would have predicted in Naledi, for example, either, based on, for example, that morphology, right? You mentioned Neanderthals. Well, Neanderthals are very, very similar to us, right? Much more similar than like Naledi, for example.
This is true.
And that's an example where, okay, perhaps some people base that based on the morphology, but I don't think based on the morphology you would have come to that conclusion, whereas we, recognizing that Homo naledi was a human, immediately assumed that it was going to exhibit such behavior and were vindicated by such studies that showed probable burial.
So I think you are, well, yeah, the burial thing is weird. I'm not going to take a stance on it because I know paleoanthropologists, it's kind of like up in the air as far as like what they're saying. I mean, I know initially the geologic work of the site showed that there wasn't reworking, so it had to be intentional. But at the same time, you know, one of the defining abilities to kind of assess sites, homesteads of Neanderthals and other fire-using hominins is the ability to detect things like ash on the ceiling, which always accumulates if you take a fire into a location, especially repeatedly. And we don't find that in the caves at Rising Star. So my issue with that is, my problem with the burial, and this is kind of inconsequential, this is my skepticism on whether or not they were burying their dead, is how they were getting in there and seeing and feeling their way around when it was so dark and when it was so difficult for a petite woman today to manage their way around with all the modern equipment that we have. You know, so how are they getting in there, depositing their dead, getting through these squeezes with no light, because there's no evidence that there was ever any fire in Rising Star. And if this was something that they were doing repeatedly, there should be. So
that kind of is based then on the idea that this extended over a long period of time, right? And I don't know that we can actually say exactly how long of a period of time those bodies were deposited.
Yeah, but I think that if we're going with your perspective of even relative dates, they're found not just in a single stratum, right? They're found through different periods of time in this cave. Now, granted, it's not spanning a lot.
That depends. I don't know, but we don't know exactly how long it took for those to form. I don't think the dates on that site are obviously very difficult to come by, and especially trying to date those individual layers.
The dates are tough, but what I'm saying is, from your perspective, even relatively, this would have at least been 2 trips with fire, right? At least 2. I mean, there's what, half a dozen individuals from Rising Star?
Right. The question is that enough evidence to leave evidence of fire thousands of years later?
I mean, it is for Neanderthals who have lived in rock shelters once. You know, I mean, so I don't know if that's...
I know, but, like, in those cases, right, we find, like, whole hearths, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so, like, they were actually, like, starting, like, whole bonfires in there. So I think it's more logical to think that we would find that in a case where they, like, settled for a little while and started a whole bonfire than just carrying a torch in a couple times.
That's true, too. But at the same time, torch wielding is also something of a different animal than utilizing fire in, like, a sort of single location area. I mean, you're direct handling it. And from an animal standpoint, these are, one requires quite a bit more forethought and planning than the other. I'm not saying that they didn't bury their dead. I just don't know. And I'm okay if it turns out that they did. I think that's really cool. I would actually think that's awesome. But I don't think we know about that one way or another. Now, with Homo naledi, if the prediction is that Homo naledi, is that this is a creationist prediction, because creationists would say all members of the Homo beramen are human. They're all equally so, or at least close to, they're in the same ballpark as each other with regard to their humanness. Then I think that creationists face a big challenge from the evolutionary prediction, which is that we should see technologies emerge through time, even if it's relative, like from your
I disagree there.
How so?
Okay, so before the flood, right, we have the story of, I think it is Tubal-Cain, who forges iron and metal, or iron and brass, I think. I think it's Tubal-Cain. So obviously, according to the creationist model, we have very sophisticated tools cropping up almost immediately, right? Within like just a couple of generations. However, we have the Tower of Babel, right? After the flood, these people come, they migrate out of the Near East, and they come to, well, not out of the Near East, but through the Near East to the site of, in the land of Shinar, to the Tower of Babel. And they're all there together, right? They're working on this city and a tower together, and God confuses their languages. And at that point, I think that we would predict that culture and cultural artifacts would suddenly take a huge hit, right? because people no longer can communicate with one another. And so they were forming some type of culture beforehand, right? So they were all working together, working on a city. And if you're working on a huge building project like that, right, you need different people allocated to different jobs, right? Everybody is not their own hunter-gatherer, right? You have some people, most likely, who are working on the building, other people who are raising animals or gathering food or whatever, right? So you have these different jobs, right? So why don't we find metal tools immediately right after the flood then? Well, possibly Noah and his family didn't know how to make metal tools, right? It's possible that technology was lost. Even if it was carried through by Noah and his family, perhaps at the Tower of Babel, it was lost again. Certain groups went some places with that knowledge and other groups didn't. And so if you were a group who's turned out of Babel, who never knew how to make stone tool or make metal, I mean, you're forced to rely on stone tools.
I agree. I mean, I've heard that kind of idea before, right? As this kind of, usually I hear it as an explanation to discuss about why do we have so many stone tools in places like Africa, right? Because from an evolutionary standpoint, humans nest within this group that goes back to the NL group, somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's kind of an answer for, okay, well, why are there so many tools? Well, because of that. But that creates a really nice prediction from the creationist side that needs to be met, which is we need to find iron tools from the likes of Tubal Cain before anything else, at least stratigraphically speaking. So if you have an idea of like which layers were deposited by the flood, and I'm not sure where you and Dr. Wood come from, but most creationists I talk to tend to think that it at least goes up to like the mid-Mesozoic. Usually they'll be like it's Cambrian to Cretaceous is the most common. So we should be able to find examples of iron. In fact, it should be nearly ubiquitous in the area of the world that these people were living in, that we're finding metal tools, which are, of course, much more robust than human remains. So can't find human remains, we should at least find the metal tools before, these depositions from the flood.
Right. So that is obviously one place where we have a prediction, right? We should find human remains and remains of their artifacts in flood layers. So I would typically place...
Right? It should be prior to...
Well, right. That's an artifact.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm just saying before the first flood layer deposits, right. You should find at least one example.
Possibly. See, here's why I wouldn't necessarily say that. Because the flood was very catastrophic, but before that, it doesn't seem like in a perfect world there would have been so much catastrophes or something, or things like that would have resulted in tons of deposition, right?
But people buried their dead. I mean, that's like
possible, but my point is, we have the flood then. The flood is raging through this area, right? The flood is raging through this area, and as a creationist, it would seem that it would have ripped up the sediment that was deposited, right? That hadn't perhaps solidified yet. And so everything that was on this land surface was kind of being swept away that wasn't like solidified right yet. So I wouldn't necessarily expect I wouldn't even necessarily expect there to be so many layers that were deposited like from creation to the flood.
I'm not even suggesting layers. I'm just saying like the way that we understand sedimentation now, right, is when in catastrophic local floods, things like the scablands, whatever, water rolls through, carries with it tons of sediment, and it slaps it down on top, and then it also carves new channels and things like that. But what it doesn't do is dig 6 feet underground and pull everything up to the surface. We don't find that kind of admixture, in any example that I can think of. So shouldn't there be, if you've got this population that's living assuming that the flood is like 4,400 years ago, for 1,600 years, people are living and dying and living in civilizations, perhaps from your perspective, and ironworking. So shouldn't we find some trace of that prior to, I don't know, like the Cambrian or maybe Silurian, depending on where you're coming from, layer being deposited?
I would think that, in particular, human remains, I would think would be most likely found in the Cretaceous. I find it very unlikely that we would actually find the remains of people who were buried before the flood, and that's kind of because of how much of a catastrophe the flood was from my view. From my view, the flood was like mind-boggling, right? It's something that's hard for us to even understand, like the effects and the forces that were at work. And so, in my view, the very earliest humans that we could hope to find would probably be ones that were buried during the flood. And you asked exactly when I thought the flood was. I would kind of accept, I guess, the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary as kind of being the end of the flood generally, and possibly a little before the Cambrian, its beginning.
So, yeah, but that, I don't know about that, because it's like the flood is capable of doing, from your perspective, and maybe you don't hold this in particular, so correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand most creationists correctly, then the flood is responsible for the massive bone beds within articulated dinosaurs, in these big, logs in a jam, big, fat titanosaur femurs, laying jagged up against each other. But it's also responsible for burying, pristine arthropods, right? Like trilobites in perfect condition, or delicate dragonflies of the Carboniferous in perfect, pristine condition. So I have an issue with the consistency there, but one of those would surely be able to get an iron tool or a human lower than the Cretaceous, but we have never found that. And if humans are like, these guys having these civilizations prior to the flood, you would suspect that there would at least be enough of them to maintain a society. And in even
right,
small societies...
So that's a question. That's certainly a good challenge, I think, to creationists, and I think that's certainly a topic that needs to have more research done. There's a number of different creationist views on that particular idea. One view would be that the purpose of the flood was to destroy the wicked humans, right? And so God just completely obliterated people and fairy system. I don't necessarily hold to that view. That seems a little ad hoc, I think, not substantiated necessarily by scripture. The other view is, okay, so these people before the flood are living for hundreds of years, according to the biblical text, right? So Adam has lots of sons and daughters, but these people are all living for such long periods of time, right, that we don't really see like a whole ton of burials and things like that, like before the flood, because like Adam, he lives like 900 years, right? So like more than half of the time between creation and the flood, right? So we wouldn't expect there to be a whole ton of death. I mean, from old age necessarily, I guess you could assert that there's possibly, infant mortality and all sorts of other types of death.
Yeah, consequences of civilization, whatever.
But the point being that there's that possibility, and also the possibility that human populations weren't particularly large. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. But I think that is something that needs to be looked into more, sure. And I think that is certainly a legitimate challenge.
Sure. Oh man, I've kept you for so long already. I'm so sorry. I don't want to keep you for too much longer because I know you've probably got class in the morning. I do as well. I'll ask, let's see. At some point, I'd love to talk to you about radiometric dating. I just think that would be a fun conversation to have. I talked with Bread of Life very recently. Like I said, we talked about radiometric dating. Because I think that radiometric dating is quite solid, and I'm interested to see kind of where you're coming from with that, as well as I'd like to present my case to put it out there. But kind of in relation more to your relative ages, how do you suppose, or rather, why do you suppose, in the case of the hominins, since we're talking about that, why do you suppose that they are in their relative positions? Do you think it's almost just chance that we see, Australopithecus, or rather Ardipithecus first, right, along with early members of perhaps like Aurantuganensis, really early Aurantuganensis and Sahelanthropus, and then we see the Australopithecines kind of come on the scene, and then we see the, from my perspective, the emergence of genus Homo. Why do you suppose is the reason for that? Is it a sampling bias where you're coming from?
I think that in regards to why exactly humans would be found later than other creatures would be the idea that, unlike other creatures, humans all first at least the great majority of humans, it seems, traveled first to Shinar, right, to work on the Tower of Babel. And thus, other creatures were able to get out into these other more remote areas before humans were able to. Right, so I think that can explain why exactly we would see Australopithecines in South Africa before we see any type of human in that region.
Do you suppose that accounts as well for like the Eastern African hominins and maybe the Northern African hominins, like the likes of say Omnivores and maybe others, and Ethiopian hominins? Because that's pretty close to the Middle East.
I'd say I'm not entirely certain about that at the moment. I would say I think generally it does account for why we see animals in the fossil record first and then humans.
Okay, all right. Well, I've kept you for long enough, and I think this has been really fun for me and really enjoyable. I think you're really very, very good at articulating where you're coming from, especially I had no idea that you were in high school, so it's really impressive that you're able to kind of get your point across as you know, as young as you are. I really, really hope that you do go on to pursue paleoanthropology. I'd be really interested to see, maybe your mind doesn't change, maybe it does, and maybe you go on and discover, you know, all these cool hominins and you know, validate your position, you know, verbatim, or maybe you change your mind and you don't. I'm very interested. I do hope you do that. So do you want to say anything else before I end the recording, and then we'll just finish up whatever we want to say here?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to say that, thank you for those kind words. I think that both views do have certain pieces of evidence which support them at the present time, right? I think you have some strong arguments that I think are needed for creationism to encounter. But I think that we also have some arguments which I don't think have been adequately addressed by you, particularly the ones about creatures falling into their kinds. And so I think that's certainly an area where people on your side of the aisle need to kind of look at this and, you know, raise some possibilities to try to explain exactly why we see that discontinuity between humans and other creatures.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of interested. I'd like to do like a deep dive into kind of your paper with regard to this clustering, your and Dr. Wood's paper with regard to this clustering, as well as kind of looking at the methods that you guys have done and the methods that other paleoanthropologists have done. And I'd like to look into that. Do send me that paper. I think I remember what it was called, looking at where hominoleti lays, and I remember the author, so I'll look it up myself. But I might do, you know, a video just strictly looking at that, and I would love to hear, if I do end up doing that, I'd love to hear yours and Todd's kind of perspective on that, on what I have to say, because you know, I'd
certainly like to keep in contact with you.
Yeah, well, I'd love, if you know, you're always welcome. I did enjoy this quite a bit, so I mean, you know, where we've already done it to death. You know where I'm coming from on all that. I am doubting these clusters are as distinct, but I will cop to it. If you're right, I will cop to it, and yeah, after I give it a good look. So I'm interested. Well, okay, Peter, I'm gonna.
Can I pray for you before we end here?
Oh yes, you may. Yes.
Okay. Father in heaven, we thank you for this time that we've had together tonight, and we thank you for your word which you have given us. I pray that you would show yourself to Erica, that you would show her your power and your might in creation, and that you would bless her studies and her work and bring her to a relationship with you. Bless us all and give us